Port, Indiana. The early 1900s. On the surface, Belle Gunness looked like a picture of resilience. A tall, broad-shouldered Norwegian immigrant, she was a widow raising children while managing a farm on her own. Neighbors described her as hard-working, no-nonsense, and determined to survive in a harsh new country. But behind that farm gate was one of the most prolific killing grounds in American history. Belle Gunness wasn't just unlucky in love. She was orchestrating one of the most chilling black widow schemes the world has ever seen. Belle was born Brynhild Polsdatter Stursif in Norway in 1859. Like many immigrants of her era, she dreamed of a better life in America. She came to Chicago, married a man named Mads Sorensen, and seemed to be on a steady path toward the American dream. But tragedy always seemed to follow her. Tragedies that left her financially better off. First came the candy store she and Sorensen ran. It mysteriously burned down. Then, Sorensen himself died on the very day his two overlapping life insurance policies both happened to be active. Belle collected the payouts and, rather than withering in grief, used the money to buy a farm in the Port, Indiana. Soon after, she remarried, this time to a man named Peter Gunness. Within a week, he was dead. Belle claimed a meat grinder fell on his head, though neighbors whispered the story didn't add up. A coroner's jury suspected foul play, but with no definitive proof, she walked away free once again. It was during her years as widowed farm owner that Belle refined her true trade, luring, killing, and profiting from men desperate for love and stability. She began placing ads in Scandinavian-language newspapers, describing herself as a lonely widow with a prosperous farm who sought a strong, capable husband to share her life. Her letters promised warmth, companionship, and financial security. But she added a peculiar request. Prospective suitors should liquidate their assets and bring their life savings to help with the farm. One by one, men answered her calls. They arrived by train, carrying cash, jewelry, or deeds. They were seen walking up her driveway, and then, nothing. They never left. Some neighbors noticed troubling signs. A hired farmhand recalled being ordered to dig large trenches in the hog pen. When he asked why they were so big, Belle coolly said they were for garbage. Others noted the constant smell of burning coming from her property, as if something more than trash was being destroyed. By 1908, suspicions had mounted, but Belle's dark empire collapsed in spectacular fashion. On April 28th, her farmhouse burned to the ground. In the ashes, investigators found the bodies of her 3 foster children and the body of a woman missing her head. Authorities initially assumed the headless corpse was Belle's, but questions soon arose. The body didn't match her size. And why was the head missing? Was this Belle's final deception? Her masterstroke to fake her own death and vanish? As the ruins cooled, police began digging around her farm. What they uncovered horrified the entire nation. Shallow graves filled the earth. Dismembered bodies, bones, and decaying remains littered the property. At least 14 victims were confirmed, but investigators suspected as many as 40. Men who had disappeared without a trace for years were suddenly accounted for in Belle's hog pen, orchard, and cellar. Among the dead was even her foster daughter Jenny, who had vanished after telling friends, "My mama killed my papa." The scale of the murders shocked America. Newspapers branded Belle Hell's Belle, Lady Bluebeard, and Dee, the Lawport Black Widow. The story spread nationwide, feeding on lurid headlines about lonely men being seduced to their doom. For many, she became the embodiment of male fears about female deception, a woman who weaponized love to bait her prey. But the most chilling part of her story remains unresolved. What happened to Belle? Was the headless body hers? Or did she kill another woman to fake her death, escaping into anonymity with whatever fortune she had amassed? Sightings of Belle trickled in for decades. Some claimed she fled to Chicago, Others swore she started over in California. None were ever proven. Belle Gunness's legacy isn't just the staggering body count. It's the system she built. She turned her farm into a machine for murder and profit. She understood the desperation of men seeking companionship in a lonely, immigrant-filled America. She exploited their dreams, drained their wealth, and discarded their lives. Even today, historians debate her final tally. 14 victims were confirmed, but estimates climb as high as 40. If true, Belle Gunness would stand alongside H.H. Holmes as one of America's earliest and deadliest serial killers. Her story has since become folklore. Books, plays, and even films have retold her crimes, cementing her place in the pantheon of Black Widows. She was a pioneer of lethal greed, decades before names like Buenoano, Blauensteiner, or Kakehi shocked the world. What makes Belle so haunting isn't just the number of lives she destroyed, it's that she may have escaped justice entirely. In Japan, marriage is considered sacred. It's about duty, loyalty, and devotion. But for Chisako Kakehi, marriage was nothing more than a hunting ground. Between 2007 and 2013, this woman, oft-spoken, grandmotherly in appearance, became infamous as Japan's most notorious Black Widow. Her weapon of choice wasn't a knife or a gun. It was cyanide, slipped into capsules of so-called health supplements. By the time investigators finally stopped her, she had left behind a trail of dead husbands and lovers and amassed a fortune of nearly $9 million. Chisako Kakehi was born in 1946 in the southern prefecture of Kagoshima. On the surface, her life seemed ordinary. She worked in a printing plant for years and married young. Her first husband was described as hard-working and loyal, that he died of an illness in 1994. Soon after, her second and third husbands also died in quick succession, each under questionable circumstances. No suspicions were raised at the time. Deaths of older men from heart failure or strokes are not unusual, and Kakehi always appeared as the grieving widow. But as the years went on, her pattern sharpened. After the death of her third husband, she inherited significant sums of money. Yet instead of settling into comfortable widowhood, she began actively seeking new relationships. In her 60s, she signed up for matchmaking services targeting wealthy or retired men. Her criteria were clear. She wanted partners who were financially secure, ideally with assets that could transfer to her in the event of death. One by one, men entered her orbit, and one by one, they ended up dead. Her fourth husband, Isao Kakehi, collapsed suddenly in December 2013, just 1 month after their marriage. He had been in good health, and the speed of his decline shocked friends and family. When police ran toxicology tests, they found lethal traces of cyanide in his system. Investigation widened their scope and began re-examining her past husbands and boyfriends. What they found was staggering. At least 3 other men in her life, 2 boyfriends and another husband, had died under strikingly similar circumstances. In each case, they collapsed suddenly, often after meals or tea. And in each case, Chisako Kakehi was the last person to see them alive. When detectives searched her home, they discovered capsules of cyanide hidden in her kitchen and garden. But the evidence didn't stop there. They found internet searches on her computer about cyanide poisoning, disguised in terms of supplements. They even discovered that she had taken out life insurance policies on some of her victims just weeks before their deaths. It was a blueprint. Meet a wealthy man, secure his trust, ensure she had financial rights to his estate, and then poison him. When she was finally arrested in 2014, the public was stunned. Here was an elderly woman, frail, white-haired, grandmotherly, accused of being a cold-blooded serial killer. The media dubbed her the Black Widow of Kyoto, a nickname that stuck as her trial began in 2017. The courtroom was packed every day. Prosecutors painted her as manipulative, greedy, and ruthless. They argued she used her age and gender as a disguise, presenting herself as a harmless old woman while systematically killing the men who trusted her. They detailed how she had slipped cyanide into drinks, using the poison to stage sudden, natural deaths that masked her crimes. Kakehi's defense tried a different angle. They claimed she suffered from dementia, that her memory was unreliable, and that she couldn't understand the charges fully. They even argued that her confessions to police, where she admitted administering poison, were the ramblings of a confused mind. But jurors were unmoved. The pattern was too clear, the evidence too overwhelming. On November 7, 2017, Chisako Kakehi was sentenced to death. At 70 years old, she became one of the oldest women ever sent to death row in Japan. Her calm reaction shocked observers. She showed little emotion as the sentence was read, as though she had already accepted her fate. In fact, at one point she even said, "I was lonely. I didn't want to be poor, and I killed. I have no excuses." Her case reverberated across Japan. Traditionally, female serial killers are rare, and elderly female serial killers almost unheard of. The idea that a 70-year-old woman could orchestrate multiple murders using such cunning and patience unsettled the entire nation. She shattered stereotypes about what a killer looks like. Over time, appeals and reviews of her case dragged on, but her conviction stood. In March 2024, she died while still on death row. Whether she would have lived long enough to face execution is now irrelevant. Her death closed the book on one of the darkest chapters in Japanese criminal history. What makes Chisako Kakehi so chilling isn't just the number of her victims, it's her method. Poison is the Black Widow's weapon of choice for a reason. It's quiet, invisible, and hard to detect. Unlike a gunshot or stab wound, cyanide mimics natural causes, making it perfect for someone who wanted to kill repeatedly without drawing suspicion. And Kakehi used it with surgical precision. She turned companionship into a business model. For her, men were not husbands or lovers. They were investments. Their lives were cash reserves waiting to be collected, and every time she slipped poison into a drink, she was cashing in. Vienna, Austria. In the 1990s, a sweet-looking elderly woman shuffled through the city's neighborhoods, visiting churches, volunteering at community centers, and chatting with her neighbors. To most people, she was a kindly pensioner, frail and grandmotherly, but behind that facade was one of Europe's most chilling predators. Her name was Elfriede Blauensteiner, and she earned a nickname that captured her true nature, Die Schwarze Witwe, the Black Widow. Blauensteiner's story begins in Vienna, where she lived an unremarkable life for decades. She married a man named Walter, raised a son, and lived in a modest apartment. But underneath her seemingly ordinary life, she was consumed by greed. She wanted more money, more property, and more control. And she was willing to kill anyone who stood in her way. Her first victim was her husband, Walter. In 1992, after decades of marriage, he suddenly fell gravely ill. He experienced severe vomiting, weakness, and organ failure. Doctors struggled to explain his rapid decline. In December of that year, he died. To outsiders, it looked like a tragic, natural death. But almost immediately after his funeral, Elfriede inherited his property, and her bank accounts grew. She played the grieving widow to perfection, but privately, she celebrated her financial gain. The following year, her son, who was disabled and lived in a care facility, also died under suspicious circumstances. Again, she benefited financially, but investigators didn't yet connect the dots. For years, Elfriede moved through Vienna, unnoticed, carefully choosing her next targets. She developed a strategy. She preyed on wealthy, elderly men who lived alone. Often she met them at church or through community groups. She presented herself as a helpful companion, offering meals, companionship, and care. Lonely and charmed, these men welcomed her into their homes. What they didn't know was that she had already set her sights on their estates. Elfriede used poison as her weapon. She often mixed barbiturates or insulin into her victims' food and drinks, slowly weakening them until they collapsed. While they suffered, she manipulated them into signing over their wills, naming her as sole heir. By the time they died, she had already secured her prize. One of her most infamous victims was an elderly man named Friedrich Dofer. She befriended him, gained his trust, and soon he fell mysteriously ill. Neighbors later testified that she became unusually controlling in his final weeks, limiting who could visit him and handling his finances. When Friedrich died, Elfriede inherited his home and money, but her greed pushed her luck too far. In 1995, she targeted a man named Alois Pichler, a wealthy retiree. As with her previous victims, she insinuated herself into his life and began poisoning him. But this time, suspicions grew. Doctors noticed abnormal test results. Alois's family questioned why Elfriede was suddenly in charge of his affairs. When Alois died, his relatives demanded an autopsy. The results showed he had been poisoned with insulin. Police opened a full investigation, and soon a disturbing pattern emerged. At least 3 men who had been close to Elfriede had died under strange circumstances, each leaving her significant inheritances. When detectives searched her home, they found syringes, vials, and documents tying her to her victims' estates. The sweet grandmotherly mask was shattered. Beneath it was a calculating serial killer. Her trial in 1997 became one of the most sensational cases Austria had ever seen. The press dubbed her the Black Widow, splashing her photo across headlines. In court, prosecutors laid out her methodical cruelty. She poisoned her victims, manipulated their wills, and left them to die while she looted their lives. They painted her as a cold-blooded predator who saw human beings only as bank accounts waiting to be drained. Elfriede's defense tried to argue that the evidence was circumstantial, that she was simply a helpful companion unfairly accused. But witness testimony and forensic evidence destroyed her claims. In 1997, she was convicted of murdering Friedrich Dofer and sentenced to life in prison. Later investigations tied her to other suspicious deaths, including her husband Walter and possibly her son. While not all could be conclusively proven, authorities believed her total victim count could be as high as 6. Even in prison, Blauensteiner remained unrepentant. Fellow inmates described her as manipulative, domineering, and obsessed with money. She continued to maintain her innocence publicly, but privately, she allegedly boasted about her schemes. In 2003, she died of a brain tumor while still serving her life sentence. She was 72 years old. The news of her death brought closure to some families, but for others, it was an unsatisfying end to a case that had left so many questions unanswered. Her case remains a warning, not just about greed, but about appearances. Evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like a grandmother offering you tea. And in the case of Elfriede Blauensteiner, that tea might just be your last drink. In the early 20th century, death was no stranger in rural America. Illness, poor sanitation, and limited medical care claimed lives every day. So when a series of men in Idaho began dying of what looked like mysterious fevers and stomach sicknesses, no one asked too many questions. But there was one woman who knew the truth, because she caused every one of those deaths. Her name was Lyda Southard, later nicknamed Flypaper Lyda, and she became one of America's earliest and most notorious Black Widows. Lyda was born in 1892 in Missouri, before her family moved west to Twin Falls, Idaho. Outwardly, she appeared like any other farm girl of her time. She married young, in 1912, to a rancher named Robert Dooley. For a while, life seemed normal, but in 1915, Robert's brother Edward, who lived with them, suddenly fell ill. His death was blamed on typhoid fever. Just months later, Robert himself grew sick. He suffered painful cramps, nausea, and wasting weakness before he died. 2 men in the same household, both gone within months. To friends and neighbors, it was tragic bad luck. To Lyda, it was her first payday. She collected Robert's life insurance and moved on with barely a pause. Her second husband, William McCaffell, entered her life in 1917. Like Robert, he was healthy when they married. Like Robert, he soon developed mysterious stomach problems. In 1918, William was dead. Once again, Lyda inherited his money, and once again, she carried herself as the grieving widow, winning sympathy from those around her. Her third marriage, to a ranch foreman named Harlan Lewis in 1918, lasted less than a year. Harlan too began to decline with the same symptoms. He died in 1919, and Lyda collected the insurance payout. By now, whispers were starting. 3 husbands dead in such a short time, all with eerily similar illnesses, was pushing coincidence past its breaking point. But Lyda had a way of disarming suspicion. She was quiet, composed, and always presented herself as the unlucky victim of cruel fate. In an era where women were rarely considered capable of cold-blooded crime, few people dared to point the finger at her. In 1919, Lyda married again, her 4th husband, Edward Meyer. Within a year, Meyer was also dead. Same symptoms, same tragic end, and the same result, another payout for Lyda. But this time, investigators finally began to take notice. A doctor who had treated Meyer compared his symptoms to those of Lyda's previous husbands. He pushed for an autopsy and raised questions about whether something more sinister was at work. Authorities exhumed the bodies of several of her dead husbands. What they found was unmistakable: arsenic. It turned out that Lyda had been poisoning her husbands using a method that shocked the public with its simplicity. At the time, household flypaper was soaked in arsenic. By boiling it in water, she could extract the poison into a liquid form. She then slipped it into meals or drinks, feeding it to her unsuspecting husbands. The poison worked slowly, causing violent illness that mimicked common diseases. To the outside world, it looked like natural death. To Lyda, it was her ticket to another insurance payout. In 1921, Lyda was arrested and put on trial. Newspapers across the country seized on the story of the young widow who had murdered husband after husband with poison brewed from flypaper. They called her Flypaper Lyda, a name that stuck. Prosecutors laid out the pattern: husband after husband, each insured, each poisoned, each replaced with another. They painted Lyda as cold, calculating, and driven purely by greed. Marriage, for her, was a business contract. Husbands weren't partners, they were investments with expiration dates. Lyda was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 10 years to life in prison. But her story didn't end there. In 1931, she staged a daring escape. With the help of another inmate, she slipped away from prison and fled to Denver, Colorado, where she lived under a false name for more than a year. Her capture in 1932 made headlines again, cementing her image as a manipulative and resourceful criminal. She spent the rest of her life in prison, dying behind bars in 1958. Lyda Southard's story is remembered not just for the number of men she killed, but for how ordinary her weapon was. Flypaper was in every kitchen. It was meant to kill insects, but she turned it into a murder tool. She didn't need a gun or a knife. All she needed was patience, a boiling pot of water, and the trust of the men she vowed to love. Los Angeles, California, the land of sunshine, Hollywood dreams, and endless reinvention. But in the early 2000s, 2 elderly women, grandmothers on the outside, were running one of the coldest, most calculated murder-for-profit schemes the city had ever seen. Their names, were Helen Golay and Olga Rutterschmidt, and together they became known as the killers behind the Black Widow murders. It started in 1999. Helen Golay, then in her late 60s, and Olga Rutterschmidt, in her 70s, began targeting homeless men on the streets of Los Angeles. These weren't chance encounters. The two women had a system, a business model of death. They sought out men who were isolated, vulnerable, and unnoticed by society. Perfect victims for a con that would take years to unfold. Their pitch was simple: a roof over their head, food, care, and companionship. For a man living on the streets, it must have seemed like salvation. But Helen and Olga weren't charitable. They were predators. While feeding and housing their victims, they secretly took out life insurance policies in their names, policies that named the women as beneficiaries. The process was methodical. They used fake addresses, false documents, and multiple insurance companies to avoid suspicion. They waited patiently, paying premiums for years while the policies matured. Then, when the timing was right, they staged the men's deaths. The first known victim was Paul Vados, a 73-year-old homeless man. In 1999, his body was discovered in an alley, appearing to be the victim of a hit-and-run accident. No one claimed him. No one asked questions. But Helen and Olga collected hundreds of thousands in insurance money. 6 years later, in 2005, the cycle repeated. This time, their victim was Kenneth McDavid, a 50-year-old drifter. The women lured him into their care, bought him food, and even paid his rent. On the surface, it looked like charity. In reality, it was grooming. When they were ready, Kenneth was found dead in a West Los Angeles alley, run over by a car. Investigators later determined he had been struck not once, but multiple times, evidence that the hit and run had been deliberate. The payouts were staggering. Between both men, Golay and Rutterschmidt collected nearly $3 million in life insurance benefits. For years, they lived comfortably off the blood money, believing they had pulled off the perfect crimes. But their greed caught up with them. Insurance companies grew suspicious of two elderly women collecting massive payouts on unrelated homeless men. Detectives began investigating, and the pieces quickly fell into place. Surveillance footage showed the women near the crime scenes. Witnesses testified that they had seen them with both victims. Forensic evidence tied the deaths together, and investigators uncovered a web of fraudulent insurance paperwork stretching back years. In 2006, Helen Golay and Olga Rutterschmidt were arrested. Their trial in 2008 became a media spectacle. Here were two elderly women, white-haired and frail-looking, accused of running an insurance scam built on cold-blooded murder. The contrast between their appearance and their crimes fascinated the public. Were these kindly grandmoths, or ruthless killers who had found a new way to monetize death? Prosecutors argued that Golay and Rutterschmidt were driven by greed, plain and simple. They pointed to the years of planning, the deliberate staging of hit-and-runs, and the massive financial windfalls that followed. They described the women as predators who targeted society's most vulnerable, men who had no families to fight for them, no one to demand justice when they disappeared. The defense tried to argue that the evidence was circumstantial, that the women were being unfairly demonized because of their age and gender. But the jury wasn't swayed. The evidence was overwhelming, the pattern undeniable. In April 2008, Helen Golay and Olga Rutterschmidt were convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy. Both were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At their age, it was effectively a death sentence. Their case became a symbol of a different kind of evil. These weren't crimes of passion or spur-of-the-moment acts of rage. These were calculated business decisions. Helen and Olga treated human lives as investments, policies that matured into profit once their victims were killed. They weren't driven by desperation. They were driven by greed, comfort, and the desire to maintain a lifestyle they couldn't afford otherwise. Even after their convictions, neither woman showed remorse. Interviews revealed a cold detachment, a refusal to acknowledge the horror of what they had done. To them, their victims were never people. They were pawns, nameless men chosen precisely because no one would miss them. What makes the Black Widow murders so haunting is the patience. Golay and Schmidt waited years, paying insurance premiums and biding their time until the right moment came to strike. Their victims lived under the illusion of kindness, believing they had been rescued, only to be betrayed in the most brutal way possible. Helen Golay and Olga Schmidt turned charity into a weapon, kindness into a disguise, and insurance policies into death warrants. They proved that predators don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like grandmothers, smiling sweetly, waiting for the right moment to cash in. In the 1980s and 1990s, a seemingly ordinary British woman was weaving a web of lies, manipulation, and eventually murder. Her name was Dena Thompson, and the press would eventually brand her the Black Widow of England. She was a con artist, a bigamist, and a killer who used charm as her weapon and greed as her motive. Unlike Belle Gunness or Chisako Kakehi, who struck with poison or violence, Dena's crimes began with deception, but her path of fraud and betrayal led to a murder that shocked the United Kingdom. Dena's story begins in Sussex, where she grew up and eventually married her first husband. But from the beginning, her relationships weren't built on love. They were opportunities. She had a talent for manipulation and a hunger for money. By the late 1980s, she had started running scams, targeting lonely men and convincing them to part with their savings. Her methods were simple. She promised love, painted pictures of a shared future, and then drained her victims of cash before moving on. Her first major crime involved bigamy. While still married, she wed a second man, lying about her past and inventing an elaborate backstory. When that relationship soured, she didn't just walk away, she exploited him financially. She forged documents, opened credit in his name, and left him drowning in debt. For Dena, men were resources. They were wallets to be emptied, lives to be exploited. But her most infamous crime came in 1996. By then, she was married to Julian Webb, a computer expert who adored her. Julian believed he had found the love of his life, but Dena saw him as another target. Behind his back, she continued her scams, defrauding other men and siphoning money into her accounts. When Julian began to question her behavior, she saw him not as a partner, but as a liability. And in Dena's world, liabilities had to be eliminated. On New Year's Day 1996, Julian Webb was found dead in his home. At first, it appeared he had died of a heart attack. He was only 31 years old, but stress and natural causes seemed plausible. However, an autopsy revealed traces of a powerful antidepressant, fluoxetine, in his system, enough to kill. Investigators began piecing together the truth. Dena had poisoned him. Police soon discovered her financial motives. In the months leading up to Julian's death, she had taken out multiple insurance policies on him. She stood to gain a substantial payout. Combined with her history of fraud, the case against her grew overwhelming. But Dena wasn't finished weaving lies. When questioned, she claimed Julian had been depressed and might have taken his own life. She painted herself as a grieving widow, insisting she had nothing to do with his death. Her performance worked for a while. Julian's death was initially ruled non-suspicious, and Dena continued her scams. But she couldn't outrun her own greed. Other victims began coming forward, men she had conned out of tens of thousands of pounds. In one case, she convinced a lover to hand over his life savings for a fictitious business scheme. In another, she drained a man's accounts while pretending to care for him. By the early 2000s, detectives reopened Julian Webb's case. Advances in forensic science strengthened the evidence against her. They discovered not only the toxic levels of fluoxetine, but also her calculated pattern of exploitation, which pointed to a clear motive: financial gain. In 2003, Dena was finally arrested and charged with Julian's murder. Her trial gripped Britain. The prosecution portrayed her as a manipulative black widow who used sex, charm, and lies to trap men in her web. They described her as cunning, greedy, and ruthless, a woman who saw relationships not as partnerships, but as opportunities for theft and ultimately murder. The defense attempted to argue that Julian's death was either accidental or self-inflicted. They emphasized her troubled background and suggested she was being demonized because she was a woman, but the jury wasn't convinced. The weight of evidence, from the poison to the insurance policies, was too heavy. In July 2003, Dena Thompson was convicted of Julian Webb's murder and sentenced to life in prison. She was also convicted of multiple counts of fraud and deception against her other victims. The judge called her a highly dangerous woman who posed a threat to any man who came near her. Even behind bars, Dena's story fascinated the public. She embodied the archetype of the Black Widow, a woman who lured men with the promise of love, only to strip them of wealth and, in one case, their life. Her crimes were a blend of psychological manipulation and cold-blooded calculation. To this day, she remains one of Britain's most notorious female killers, a Black Widow whose crimes combined the cruelty of murder with the devastation of fraud. Unlike other serial poisoners, Dena didn't rely solely on death for her profit. She drained her victims alive first, and when they became a risk, she finished the job. In the quiet towns of North Carolina, Blanche Taylor Moore looked like the picture of Southern respectability. A church-going woman, always polite, always smiling. To friends and neighbors, she seemed like a devoted wife and caregiver, but behind the smile was a predator. Over decades, Blanche poisoned the men in her life, husbands, boyfriends, and even her own father. Her weapon of choice was arsenic, a toxin as old as murder itself. By the time investigators uncovered her crimes, at least 4 men had died, and Blanche had earned her place as one of America's most infamous Black Widows. Blanche was born in 1933 in Concord, North Carolina. Her childhood was difficult. Her father was an alcoholic and reportedly abusive, while her mother was distant and cold. From a young age, Blanche learned how to manipulate to get what she wanted. She was bright, charming, and skilled at presenting herself as trustworthy, even when she wasn't. In the 1950s, she married James Taylor, a man who adored her. But by the 1970s, James began suffering strange health problems. He experienced nausea, stomach pain, and weakness. Doctors assumed it was natural illness. In 1973, he died. His death certificate listed heart failure, and Blanche collected insurance money. Nobody questioned the grieving widow. Not long after, her father, Parker Davis, also died suddenly. His symptoms were eerily similar: vomiting, weakness, and sudden collapse. Again, no one suspected foul play. Blanche played the role of the dutiful daughter, never letting anyone see what lay beneath. In the 1980s, Blanche moved on to new relationships. She dated a man named Raymond Reed, a store manager who treated her generously. Soon, he too began experiencing mysterious health issues. Over several years, his condition deteriorated. In 1986, he died, and Blanche once again inherited. The pattern was repeating, but still, no alarms were raised. By 1989, Blanche had set her sights on yet another man, Reverend Dwight Moore, a well-respected pastor. They began dating seriously, and Dwight saw Blanche as the perfect partner. But soon after they became engaged, he fell gravely ill. He was hospitalized with severe nausea, neurological problems, and organ failure. Doctors were baffled until one toxicologist considered an old-fashioned cause: arsenic poisoning. Testing confirmed it. Dwight Moore's body was saturated with arsenic at levels so high that doctors said it was a miracle he survived. When investigators looked back at Blanche's past, the puzzle pieces snapped into place. The mysterious deaths of James Taylor, Parker Davis, and Raymond Reed all matched the same pattern. Exhumations confirmed the truth. High levels of arsenic were found in her deceased husband and boyfriend. The sweet, church-going widow had been systematically poisoning the men closest to her. The case against Blanche was overwhelming. She had access to the poison, she was the common link between all the victims, and she had a clear motive: money and control. For Blanche, men weren't partners. They were tools to provide financial stability, and when they were no longer useful, they became disposable. Her trial in 1990 captivated the nation. The media branded her the Black Widow of North Carolina. Prosecutors argued she was a cold, calculating killer who used the slow, agonizing death of arsenic poisoning as her method. Arsenic isn't a quick death. It attacks the body gradually, creating symptoms that mimic illness. Victims suffer vomiting, diarrhea, burning pain, and organ failure. To inflict that on people you claim to love takes a level of cruelty few can comprehend. Blanche's defense tried to paint her as misunderstood, a victim of circumstance, even suggesting the men had ingested arsenic accidentally, but the jury didn't buy it. In November 1990, she was convicted of murdering Raymond Reed and sentenced to death. Blanche became the oldest woman on death row in the United States. She remained in prison for decades, her sentence upheld through appeal after appeal. Even in confinement, she showed little remorse. To the end, she denied responsibility, maintaining her innocence despite the mountain of evidence against her. Her case remains one of the most infamous in American criminal history because of how perfectly it embodies the Black Widow archetype. Blanche Moore didn't kill in fits of rage. She didn't strike impulsively. She killed slowly, carefully, over months and years, all while maintaining the image of a loving wife, a caring daughter, a devoted partner. Neighbors remembered her as kind and polite. Church members recalled her sitting in the pews, singing hymns. Nobody suspected she was poisoning the very men who trusted her most. Today, Blanche Taylor Moore remains in prison, one of the oldest women on death row. She never faced execution, but her legacy is cemented. She is a reminder that evil doesn't always look like a monster in the dark. For her, devotion was just a mask, and beneath that mask was one of the deadliest Black Widows in history. Victorian England was a world of soot-stained streets, industrial progress, and rigid social expectations. It was also a world where death lurked everywhere. Disease, accidents, and poverty claimed lives daily. In such an environment, one woman discovered she could turn tragedy into profit. Her name was Marianne Cotton, and she is remembered as Britain's first and most infamous Black Widow. With a vial of arsenic and a smile that concealed her true nature, she poisoned her way through husbands, lovers, and even her own children. By the time she was finally caught, her trail of death stretched across decades, leaving a body count that still shocks historians today. Marianne was born in 1832 in Low Moorsley, a mining village in northeast England. She grew up in poverty, the daughter of a miner, and quickly learned that life was precarious. At 16, she left home to work as a nurse, then married her first husband, William Mowbray, when she was 20. Together they had several children, but tragedy struck again and again. Many of their children died young, supposedly from gastric illnesses that swept through poor households. Neighbors pitied the young couple, but some noticed that Marianne never seemed crushed by grief. In 1865, William Mowbray himself died suddenly. His symptoms were violent vomiting, stomach cramps, and exhaustion, classic signs of arsenic poisoning. Marianne collected his life insurance payout and quickly remarried. It would become a pattern that defined her life. Marriage, sudden illness, insurance money, and moving on to the next man. Her second husband, George Ward, fell ill not long after their wedding. He wasted away, complaining of stomach pain and nausea. Again, doctors assumed it was natural sickness. Again, Mary Ann inherited money. Then came James Robinson, a widowed carpenter with children of his own. Mary Ann became his housekeeper, then his lover, then his wife. Soon after, Robinson's children began to die mysteriously. His mother, who lived with them, also perished. Finally, James himself grew suspicious of Mary Ann. He threw her out of the house before she could finish her work on him. He may have been the only man she married who survived. But Mary Ann wasn't done. She married Frederick Cotton, a pitman from County Durham. By now, her reputation was murky, but she always found ways to charm her way into new lives. With Frederick, she had more children. Predictably, he died of gastric illness, followed by several of the children. Mary Ann then took up with another man, quickly moving him into the Cotton household. When he too grew sick, suspicions finally reached their breaking point. The final thread that unraveled her web was her stepson, Charles Edward Cotton. Mary Ann openly complained to neighbors that she didn't want to care for him anymore, and she let slip that he was soon going to die. When Charles fell ill and died shortly after, the local doctor grew alarmed. An autopsy revealed lethal amounts of arsenic in his body. Authorities ordered investigations into Mary Ann's past. The pattern was undeniable. Every man she married, every lover she took, and many of her children had died in the same way. By the time she was arrested in 1872, officials believed she may have killed as many as 20 people. The exact number will never be known, because death records in Victorian England were often vague. But at least 4 husbands, a lover, her mother, and up to 11 of her children are thought to have been poisoned by her hand. Her trial was a sensation. The press called her the Black Widow, the West Auckland poisoner, and the most prolific female killer in British history. The evidence was overwhelming. She had purchased arsenic repeatedly. She had been the caretaker for every victim, and she had profited financially after each death. Her demeanor in court shocked many. She was calm, even cheerful at times, as though the deaths meant nothing to her. On March 24th, 1873, Mary Ann Cotton was hanged at Durham Gaol. Her execution drew a massive crowd. The gallows failed to kill her instantly, and witnesses reported that she struggled and convulsed for several minutes before dying. It was a grim end for a woman who had inflicted so much slow, painful suffering on others. Mary Ann Cotton's story is horrifying, not only for its scale, but for its intimacy. These weren't strangers she killed. They were her husbands, her children, her mother, the very people who trusted her most. She weaponized domestic life itself, turning the Victorian ideal of the nurturing wife and mother into a death sentence. Today, Mary Ann Cotton remains a legend in true crime history. Her name is still whispered in Durham, her crimes retold in books, documentaries, and even nursery rhymes. Mary Ann Cotton, she's dead and she's rotten. She lies in her bed with her eyes wide open. She is remembered as Britain's first serial killer of the modern era, and perhaps its most chilling. Mary Ann Cotton didn't just poison her family, she poisoned the very idea of trust within the home. And for that, she stands as one of the most evil Black Widows in history. On the morning of March 27, 1995, Maurizio Gucci, the last heir to the legendary Gucci fashion empire, was gunned down outside his Milan office. The murder shocked Italy. Gucci was not only a titan of the fashion world, but also a symbol of old-money glamour. But what stunned the world even more was the person behind the plot. His ex-wife, Patrizia Reggiani. Beautiful, extravagant, and unapologetically ambitious, she orchestrated her husband's assassination and earned herself the title, the Black Widow of Italy. Patrizia Reggiani was born in 1948 to a modest family in northern Italy. Her mother remarried a wealthy businessman, lifting Patrizia into a world of privilege. She grew up obsessed with status, luxury, and appearances. When she met Maurizio Gucci in the late 1960s, she saw more than just a charming law student. She saw a ticket into one of the most prestigious families in Europe. The two married in 1972, and Patrizia quickly embraced her role as a high society wife. They lived in lavish homes, attended glittering parties, and became fixtures of the European elite. But beneath the glamour, cracks were forming. Maurizio was shy and reserved, while Patrizia was outspoken, demanding, and unafraid of conflict. Over time, their marriage became strained. In the 1980s, Maurizio inherited a large stake in the Gucci empire, and the pressure of managing both the company and his marriage pushed him further away from Patrizia. By 1985, he had left her, claiming he was going on a short business trip. Instead, he never came back. For Patrizia, it was the ultimate betrayal. She had built her identity around being Mrs. Gucci, and now that status was ripped away. The divorce was finalized in 1994, but Maurizio's decision to remarry, he was engaged to a younger woman, sent her into a spiral of rage. In interviews, she admitted she was consumed by jealousy and fury. "I was against divorce," she once said. "I don't believe in divorce. I believe in murder." Patrizia's words weren't just theatrics. She meant them. She began confiding in her psychic and close friend, Giuseppina Auriemma, about her desire to see Maurizio dead. Together, they hatched a plot to hire hitmen to carry out the assassination. Patrizia financed the scheme, providing the money that eventually paid for the bullets. On that March morning in 1995, Maurizio Gucci was walking up the steps to his office when a gunman shot him 4 times, killing him instantly. The murder looked professional, clean, and cold. For nearly 2 years, investigators searched for answers, but the Gucci empire was full of rivals, family feuds, and business enemies. The list of suspects was endless. But in 1997, police got a break. Through a combination of phone taps, informants, and confessions, they uncovered the shocking truth. Patrizia Reggiani had ordered the hit. Along with her psychic, Auriemma, and 2 hired gunmen, she had orchestrated Maurizio's assassination down to the last detail. The revelation stunned Italy. The glamorous socialite, who once dazzled in diamonds, was now revealed as a calculating black widow. Her trial in 1998 became an international media circus. Reporters from around the world flocked to Milan to cover the downfall of the Gucci widow. Patrizia, ever theatrical, treated the courtroom like a runway. She wore designer clothes, carried herself with arrogance, and made cutting remarks. At one point, she even compared herself to Elizabeth Taylor. She showed little remorse, insisting she had been wronged, that Maurizio had humiliated her by leaving her for another woman. Prosecutors argued that her motive was clear: money and revenge. Despite the divorce, Patrizia still received a generous alimony of $900,000 a year. But if Maurizio had remarried, that sum could have been reduced. Killing him preserved her financial security while satisfying her desire for vengeance. The jury found her guilty. In 1998, Patrizia Reggiani was sentenced to 29 years in prison, later reduced to 26. Her co-conspirators, including her psychic, were also convicted. For years, she remained behind bars, but even in prison, she clung to her identity as Maurizio's widow. She continued to wear expensive clothes and insisted she was entitled to her Gucci alimony, even after being convicted of his murder. Incredibly, the courts agreed, and she continued to collect her payments while incarcerated. Patrizia was released in 2016 after serving 18 years. Reporters swarmed her as she walked out of prison, but she remained unrepentant. Asked why she had her husband killed, she famously replied, "My eyesight is not so good. I didn't want to miss." Today, Patrizia Reggiani lives in Milan, often spotted walking her pet parrot or shopping in high-end boutiques. She's treated as both a pariah and a curiosity, a woman who embodies greed, jealousy, and the extremes of love turned toxic. Our story was so sensational that it inspired the 2021 film House of Gucci, with Lady Gaga portraying her on screen. What makes Patrizia Reggiani's case so haunting is how personal it was. This wasn't about strangers or distant victims. It was about betrayal within one of the most famous families in the world. It was about love curdling into hate, about privilege turning into poison. She didn't need to kill Maurizio Gucci. She was already rich, already famous, already living a life of luxury. But for Patrizia, losing her status as Mrs. Gucci was worse than death, so she chose murder. On March 30th, 1998, in Florida, a woman walked into the execution chamber at the state prison. She was small, composed, and eerily calm. Strapped into the electric chair, she became the first woman executed in Florida since 1848. Her name was Judy Buenoano, and by the time she died, she had already earned her infamous nickname, the Black Widow. Her crimes spanned decades, claiming her husband, her son, and her lovers. Every death carried the same motive: money. Judy Buenoano was born Julius Welty in 1943 in Texas. Her early life was troubled. Her mother died when she was young, and her father remarried a woman Judy despised. She grew up rebellious, difficult, and desperate to escape. By her late teens, she had changed her name to Buenoano, a Spanish-sounding twist she invented herself to give her life a more exotic air. It meant nothing, but it made her stand out. In 1962, she married James Goodyear, an Air Force sergeant. On the surface, their marriage looked stable, but within a year, James began suffering from mysterious illnesses. He grew weak, nauseated, and unable to work. In September 1971, he died suddenly at just 37 years old. His death was listed as natural causes. Judy collected his life insurance, collected sympathy, and moved on. Soon after, her next partner, Bobby Joe Morris, also died in eerily similar fashion. He had been living with Judy in Colorado when he became sick with what doctors thought was a stomach ailment. He died in 1978, and once again, Judy walked away richer. But the most shocking crime was yet to come. In 1979, Judy's own son, Michael, fell mysteriously ill. Michael was 19, a healthy army recruit. Suddenly, he developed severe weakness and nerve damage. Doctors couldn't explain it, but his condition worsened until he was paralyzed from the waist down. He was discharged from the army and returned to live with his mother, confined to a wheelchair. For Judy, Michael was no longer a son. He was a burden. He required care, time, and money. And Judy didn't tolerate burdens. In 1980, she invited Michael on a canoe trip in Florida. Out on the river, the canoe capsized. Michael, unable to swim because of his paralysis, drowned. His mother calmly reported it as a tragic accident, but investigators later found she had taken out a large life insurance policy on Michael just months earlier. By now, suspicions were growing. The string of deaths around Judy was impossible to ignore. Authorities began exhuming bodies and conducting toxicology tests. What they found was chilling. James Goodyear, her husband, had arsenic in his system. And so did Bobby Joe Morris. Judy had been poisoning them slowly, disguising their symptoms as natural illness. Her son Michael hadn't been poisoned, but his death had been staged just as carefully. His drowning no accident, but a calculated killing for cash. As detectives dug deeper, they uncovered more. Another boyfriend, John Gentry, nearly became her next victim. Judy had convinced him to take vitamin capsules she provided. In reality, they were laced with poison. Gentry collapsed, but survived. Suspicious, police searched his home and discovered evidence linking Judy to insurance scams, poisons, and the deaths of multiple partners. The trial that followed in the 1980s revealed the true scale of Judy's crimes. Prosecutors called her greedy, manipulative, and utterly without remorse. They showed how she targeted men who trusted her, slowly poisoned them, and collected their insurance money. They painted her as a woman who saw every relationship not as love, but as opportunity. Her conviction came in stages. In 1983, she was convicted of first-degree murder for killing her husband, James Goodyear. In 1984, she was convicted of insurance fraud and attempted murder in the John Gentry case. In 1985, she was convicted of murdering her own son, Michael, by drowning. The cumulative sentences added up to death. What set Judy apart from other black widows was her willingness to cross every line. Killing husbands was horrific enough, but she went further, killing her own son, for money, for convenience, for greed. The sheer coldness of that decision stunned even hardened investigators. Her time on death row was marked by the same detached composure she displayed in life. She rarely showed remorse, never confessed, and insisted she was misunderstood. But the evidence was undeniable. Her web of poison, drowning, and staged accidents had been untangled, and every strand pointed back to her. On March 30th, 1998, Judy Buenoano was led to the electric chair. Witnesses described her as calm, even serene. There were no tears, no apologies, no last-minute breakdowns. As the current surged through her body, she became Florida's first female execution in 150 years and one of America's most notorious black widows. Her legacy is one of pure betrayal. She turned marriage into a hunting ground, motherhood into a death trap, and love into a transaction. Judy Buenoano stands as the ultimate black widow, killing husband, lover, and child alike. And in the end, the only thing she couldn't outwit was the electric chair. They promised love, but brought death. These black widows turned marriage into murder and family into paydays. From arsenic in a teacup to bullets on the street, they showed that the deadliest betrayal often comes from the person closest to you. This was the most evil black widows in history. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because the next story might be even darker.